All right. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone here today. I'm so thrilled you could join us. This is part 2 of our session on Complicating the Narratives meets Solutions Journalism. We are doing these sessions now because we are launching a very exciting first of its kind fellowship for US journalists that is inviting them to pitch projects around stories that both cover solutions and complicate the narratives. And we thought no better way to kick off this fellowship than to give you an idea of the kind of stories we're hoping to seed from 3 lovely journalists who have done it. So we're going to be hearing today from Sharon Riley, from Priyanka Shankar, and from Emily Kasriel. And the way that it's going to work is they're each going to present for about 15 minutes or so. As they're presenting, feel free to pop your questions in the chat, and they're going to try to take them at the end of each presentation. Then at the very, very end, we're going to have time for questions about the fellowship itself and anything else you might want to ask. So just as we're going through this today, it would be super helpful if you're not speaking, if you could go on mute, just so we don't pick up that background noise. And if you do have a question that you'd like one of the presenters to address, feel free to either use that hand raise function or pop it in the chat. All right, and I love all these introductions we've got going in the chat. Hello, Rebecca, Christopher, Greg, Lainey, Ashley. We love to see it. All right, so just gonna let 2 more folks in from the waiting room. We are gonna get started with the wonderful Sharon J Riley, who, fun fact, just had a baby last week. So we're extra delighted that Sharon could be here today, spending some of her time with us. Sharon is an award-winning journalist based in Edmonton in Alberta, Canada. She's the Prairie's bureau chief for the Narwhal, a Canadian online magazine focusing on energy and the environment. As you can see, her writing has been published in lots of places: The Walrus, Harper's, The Tyee, Maisonneuve, among others. Her research has appeared in The Intercept, Politico, Washington Post Magazine, many others. Welcome, Sharon. All right, so Sharon, what are you going to be talking about with us today?
Yeah, thank you, Jules. I was happy to see someone saying they love Edmonton, so I was going to back up and say that probably no one knows where Edmonton is on this Zoom call today, but at least one person does, which is really exciting. Edmonton I usually describe to Americans as being north of Montana, quite a bit north of Montana, and it's in the province of Alberta, which I'll talk a bit about on the screen here. These are both from a couple of years ago, from when I first started with the Narwhal and when I first heard about Complicating the Narrative and Amanda Ripley had first published her blog. And they were both heavily influenced by that approach. And I would call them both solutions journalism stories as well. So I just want to switch to the next slide, Jules. So before I start talking about the stories themselves, I just wanted to give you a little bit of context about Alberta. Alberta is a pretty conservative province. It's very resource extractive industry dependent. There is a lot of coal mining in Alberta, which has been really contentious lately. We're also home to the oil sands, which is a huge producer of bitumen, as well as a lot of conventional oil and gas infrastructure. And so we have a lot of really fraught debates in the province about the future of these industries. These industries are really important to the province and to thousands and thousands of workers who depend on the jobs that come from them, as well as the spin-off industries that support these industries. So when we're talking about the impacts, when we talk about climate change and all the other environmental impacts or social impacts that come along with these industries, we often get into really polarized topics. And really polarized conversations where it just even the mention of the word pipeline can entirely divide a room and shut down a conversation. So people won't speak to each other without having a lot of preconceived notions. So that's a little context about Alberta. If you want to switch to the next slide again, we'll just look at my stories again. So the two stories that I wanted to talk about today were both really trying to dive into what it looks like as these industries inevitably wind down. So for one, we're looking at the coal industry, specifically at coal-fired electricity, which has been a huge part of Alberta's electricity grid for many, many years. And obviously has a lot of emissions associated with it and negative impacts. And the other is an ongoing conversation about the oil and gas industry in Alberta, which is much larger and employs a lot of people, but is, I just heard somebody talking there. There's a lot of conversations about wanting to make sure that as we transition to other sources of resources, that the workers who are in that industry have a way to continue forward. So if you want to switch to the next slide, I'll tell you a bit about those stories more specifically. So this was back when I first started the Narwhal. I wanted to write about coal in particular, because in Alberta and in Canada, we've committed to phasing out coal-fired, which is really positive from a lot of people's perspective for the environment. But as you can imagine, there are a lot of very complicated views from people who work in the industry or who live in towns where they have always depended on the industry. So this was me as a brand new reporter for the Narwhal. I got the opportunity to go out to a union hall to meet with coal miners who wanted to talk. It was one of my first assignments. I was a bit nervous. I actually printed off Amanda Ripley's list of the 22 questions to complicate the narrative. I had those, those are the ones. I was armed with those. And, you know, when we got there to the union hall, one of the first things people said was, oh, so we looked at the Narwhal online. So are you a bunch of environmentalists? And the photographer I was with, Amber Bracken, who's a lot of her photos are in this presentation today, and we had to explain, you know, we're journalists and we cover the environment, but that doesn't make us environmentalists, because that just right off the bat can be a very polarizing conversation. And these questions ended up being just incredibly useful as a starting point in a bunch of conversations that I had that day. I ended up having hour-long conversations with 6 or 7 coal miners, and then just general chatting with everyone else while we all had lunch. And I think one of the most important things for me about the idea of complicating the narrative is not just using this approach in your journalism, but also using it to check your own assumptions before you get there. So I obviously went into this union hall thinking there's going to be a lot of people here who don't want to lose their jobs and have very strong feelings about what climate change is or is not. And, you know, I just had some prejudices, I suppose. And I was floored by what I found when I actually went there and talked to people. One of the first people that I spoke to was a vegan coal miner, and there was a coal miner who was actually very excited to be losing his job because he felt trapped in it, and he was really concerned about the human health impacts of air pollution. And then there were coal miners who desperately did not want to lose their jobs, didn't believe climate change was real, and just like the whole spectrum. And I think for me, allowing myself to, you can't get rid of your own narrative on things, you can't get rid of your own personal bias, but you can start to question it even before you report the story. And I think if you're willing to complicate your own narrative, do a little research in advance, start asking some questions about maybe the things that you believe before you start going in and talking to people, that can really help your reporting and make you much more empathetic and open up the conversation for the people who you end up talking with ultimately. If you want to go to the next slide, Jules, I'll just show a couple examples. So this is one of the coal miners that I spoke to. I think when you start asking questions that get more to people's personal stories and their own beliefs, you get beyond whatever they saw on Facebook last night about, some partisan thing they're angry about, and get more to their deeply held feelings. And so this guy, he's talking about one of the reasons he wants to stay in his job is because of his family. And I think this is something that is important for readers who were coming to the Narwhal for environment-focused coverage to understand that even though this might be a solution to a big, huge problem in Alberta with coal-fired electricity, it does have ramifications. And so my story was looking at the government program that had been proposed to try to help coal workers phase themselves out of their industry. Um, what what I wanted to do is really examine whether that program was working, and I wanted to hear from people who were most affected. If you want to go to the next slide, there's just a couple other quotes there. Yeah, this is the coal miner who was actually had never finished high school and was really hoping this would be a chance for him to get out of coal mining, which is something I didn't expect to hear. I'm excited to lose my well-paying job. And if you want to go to the next slide, just briefly talk about the other story that I worked on in the same series, which is about oil and gas workers who had chosen to leave the industry and switch to solar. This was actually the story that I originally started pursuing when I started with the Narwhal. I was really interested in former oil and gas workers who were working in renewables. But when I started going to conferences and talking to people, I found that that was actually a lot more challenging for individuals than one might hope. Speaking to experts on this, workers aren't pegs that you can move from hole to hole. They have their own reasons for why they work in the industries that they do or why they live in the places that they do. And so, as the mayor of one resource dependent town told me, they're not going to just go from being coal miners to opening up ice cream shops. So we need to be cognizant of that. And so what my reporting was really trying to do is explore all these different impacts while still keeping in mind the bigger issue and the bigger solutions that we needed to look at. If you want to go to the next slide. Yeah, so speaking of solutions, with the one story, with the coal story, there had been a solution proposed. It was a government proposed solution. It involved paying for workers to access education for retraining. It involved a certain amount of unemployment insurance so that they could either get to retirement or they could look for a new job. It involved helping with moving expenses if they had to leave. So what I wanted to do with that story was really look at the solution that had been proposed, but also look at other similar stories in other jurisdictions, as well as things that had happened in the past. Whereas with the renewable energy workers story, there had been no Alberta proposed solution. These were individuals who saw a problem in their own lives and were looking to fix it. And that's a very different type of solution. It's not not a societal level. It's looking at a few individuals who've decided to make a shift. Do you want to go to the next slide? Yeah, so I'll kind of leave it there. If anyone has more questions, I'd be happy to talk more about these. But what I wanted to really say is that the complicating the narrative questions, where you sit down and really try to examine the heart of polarization, really try to get at people's personal feelings, they really do work. And I find myself referencing them all the time. I also, yes, obviously spending time talking to people and really getting into their deeply held beliefs is of utmost importance to me. I also think that in particular, it sounds great. And there are a lot of people who are really enthusiastic about the proposed solution. But I didn't want to write the story that was just, here's an amazing good news story. Coal-fired electricity is disappearing in Alberta. That'll be great for climate. And there's absolutely no downsides to that whatsoever, because that's not what I was hearing from people on the ground. So I wanted to apply a critical eye on to the solution with, not tearing it apart, but I wanted to look at what's working, what's not working, what could be improved, and really get into the details of it. And yeah, like I mentioned, looking to the past and to other jurisdictions for comparisons is one of the foundations of solutions journalism, in my opinion. And I think that even if that doesn't end up in your reporting, that is such a crucial part of understanding an issue. And, for my own work, I cover oil and gas a lot. Speaking to other journalists in other regions has been really useful. Talking to a journalist who covers oil and gas in North Dakota or Louisiana, I might not be writing a story that says, here's how North Dakota is doing something better than Alberta is, but informing my work by knowing what issues are happening in other places and by talking to historians and knowing how these things have played out in the past can really help understand an issue. So I'll leave it there. I haven't been looking at the chat at all because I cannot multitask that well. But Jules, were there any questions?
Sharon, thank you so much. Renata just said in the chat, she said it best, this is such a great example of where complicating the narratives meets solutions journalism. I love how you explained how you really had to get to those deep motivations, use those questions. We call that getting to the bottom of the deep V before you could come back up on the other side and start investigating solutions that might speak to these deeper motivations. So I just loved that. And I think we have time maybe for one or two questions or comments from any folks in the audience. If you could just use the hand raise function, that would be great. Otherwise, we can always save some questions for the end. Oh, it looks like Renata, you have a question. Did you want to come off mute and ask?
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, in general, for complicating the narrative and this type of reporting, is there any particular data types that come into play often or are most helpful, or does it really depend on the story?
Yeah, data types. I mean, I hate to be the person who says it just really depends on the story, but I think it does really depend on the story. I don't know if Jules, if you have any more insights, you work on these all the time, but.
Yeah, that's a great question. Oftentimes in our traditional solutions journalism trainings, we give examples of different data that might be useful. What I think is unique about complicating the narratives is that first we want to really complicate this narrative, understand what is the true problem before we can uncover the solution. And so if you look to Sharon's story, I really like what Sharon, you said about looking to past and other jurisdictions. This is a problem that that is faced not uniquely to Alberta. This is a problem faced around the world. So, and certainly around the rest of Canada. So I think that could be very good for complicating the narratives, in particular, comparison to what other places are doing or have done in the past and with what success. So great question.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think like with any data, the key is to really dig down into it and try to figure out what people on the ground are really feeling and saying. Because data can show one thing, and then once you get there, you might hear a whole different bag of feelings or emotions or realities. And I think just being willing to go beyond the data is a really important part of complicating the narrative too.
Great. Thank you so much, Sharon. I think we have time for Jody's question, and depending on time, possibly one more, but let's hear from Jody.
Well, hi, hi, Sharon. Thank you so much for being here. This is great. I was thinking of saving this till the end because I think I'd love to hear everybody's reaction to this question. But you were a staff writer at Narwhal, right? Is that correct? So, I mean, I used to work for a daily newspaper. Narwhal is obviously a magazine, not a newspaper, but how much time did your editors give you? Because that's, I think, one of the things that some people who are staff writers might come up against in terms of having the time. You know, how much time did you spend on this story, and how were your editors with that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I should give the caveat that I'm very lucky to be a staff writer at the Narwhal, where I am afforded the time to really dig into these issues. And I completely understand that for, say, a daily news reporter, you're just not going to have the time to. I spent a full day at just hanging out at this union hall. It's not where I live. It's a couple hours drive away. That alone is a significant investment. Then all the phone calls and the reviewing of looking at old stories, and I was going through old newspapers looking at what people had said in previous times of coal towns collapsing. All that took a long time. I would say from this time this story was first sort of conceptualized to when it was published was a couple of months, but I was working on other stories as well, so it's hard to put an exact number of hours on it. But that's where I think like that list of questions that we briefly showed there come in really handy for anybody. It's just the idea of, even if you're on the phone for a 15-minute conversation, just asking a question that's like a little bit different from what people expect to hear can sort of throw them off their script and maybe get you out at least at the beginning of complicating the narrative, and have them have your source get to something different than what they might have said if you had just asked, can you tell me about this issue? Or some other very vague question.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sharon. I think let's take one last question from Chris, and then we will let you go. And we really appreciate your time. As we said, we know you have a new baby. So thank you so much again for joining us this morning. Let's hear from Chris before we hear from Priyanka.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. I was just curious, like you found a lot of ways that solutions journalism and complicating the narratives integrated really well. I wondered, like, if you found any challenges in trying to put them together at the same time and how you navigated those, if you did.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges that I come across is I want to give people, like individuals, a platform to share their feelings, and I want to get to their deeply held beliefs. But occasionally, their deeply held beliefs are not rooted in science, or are not something that I would be wanting to print. And that's a really difficult conversation because these people are affected by this proposed solution. I'm talking about coal miners in particular. They're affected, they're 100% they're stakeholders in this issue. But I'm not going to interview them, and if they say, you know, climate change isn't real and this is dumb and we shouldn't have phased out coal, that's a really delicate thing to try to incorporate into a story. And that's a big challenge. And I can drop the link into the chat after I finish talking. You can look and see how I've sort of handled it. I wanted to, you know, address that people felt that coal had improved over the years, that it wasn't as emissions intensive as it used to be, but also present some scientific research and some experts speaking about how that is situated into the global reality when it comes to climate change, without making it seem like I interviewed some, you know, hillbilly and here's what the smart people say. I think there's a way to like humanize people's feelings, and that's what some of those complicating the narrative questions get at too. It's like, why do you believe what you believe? I don't want to know so much like all the conspiracy theories you read on the internet. I want to know why you believe those things, or why you're predisposed to believing them. That's a challenge.
It's a great question, Chris, and that's a great answer, Sharon. This is something definitely we anticipate our fellows coming up against. So please do drop that link in the chat. And thank you again, Sharon, for your presentation and your time. We will certainly be looking to this example. So
yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Next up, we are going to hear from Priyanka Shankar. I will just read her bio. Originally from India, currently shuttling from between Belgium and the Netherlands, Priyanka is an independent journalist, reporting on freedom, human rights, interested in podcasting. She is currently freelancing, and previously she worked with a publication we love called Are We Europe and Reuters in India. So Priyanka, take it away.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, great. Thanks a lot, Jules. And I can't see anybody, but nice to meet you all. And I'm really excited that this fellowship's being started in the US. Because honestly, I think complicating the narrative changed my life, both professionally and also personally, because I think, as Sharon said, you really learn to listen to understand, and that's a great skill to have. I don't know if the slides work here because I'm not able to really change it, but yeah, so as Jules said, so I got introduced to complicating the narrative in 2020 by Nina and Helen at Sojo, and it was around the same time when the Black Lives Matter protests started around the world. And in Europe, when I went for the protests, each of the placards were more about Europe's relationship with colonialism, which before that I was in Belgium for a year already, and it wasn't really spoken about. And this was that 1 month where everybody started talking about it, but it was also a very uncomfortable conversation for people to have. And back then I was freelancing with a magazine called Are We Europe, which basically focuses on stories about European identity and culture. And me and my friend and colleague Inba, we pitched it to the managers of the magazine and said, I think we really need to produce a publication on Europe's relationship with colonialism and sort of like unsilencing the uncomfortable conversations which haven't really been had. And then I think coming from a former colony myself, it's often something that we don't really discuss. It's very contentious, it's polarizing, it's painful. Everyone's experiences are so different, and we are trying to like produce this magazine. We weren't really sure how to go about it until I call Nina and Helen my fairy godmothers, because they really introduced me to complicating the narrative and really taught us how we can just embrace the complexity of this topic and understand that it's hard, but we have to start having conversations about it. So I mean, that's kind of how we produced the whole magazine using Complicating the Narratives, where we looked at how colonialism is spoken about in education, in the aid sector, also in photography. Beside everyone who is a part of editing and writing stories for the magazine sort of had a workshop where firstly we learned to listen differently, where we got introduced to a process called looping, where you kind of basically it's actually an interviewing technique where you keep asking your source questions until you get to the underlying motive of why they think the way they think about a particular topic. So it's something like colonialism, whether it's between a former colony and a former colonial power, and if they have a conversation, then we had someone from Belgium and Congo talk about it, and students in Africa and Europe exchange views using looping. Looping is also something that's really useful in your personal life. It's something that I still do. Instead of venting now, I loop with my friends, which is great. But basically, after you loop, you really get to the bottom of the problem. It helps you sort of embrace the complexity of the topic. And also as a journalist, you can confirm confirmation bias, where especially in these polarizing topics, it helps you understand that, okay, one group thinks about it this way, but what about the other group? Do they think about it the same way? And it really helps in like also challenging your own personal confirmation biases on topics. I know that happened to me with this topic like colonialism. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, this is just a little bit the magazine, and as I said, it covered the different aspects. It basically looked into starting the conversation on embracing the complexity of colonialism, but some stories also found solutions of like how this could be tackled. There was one particular story in this magazine about the case of Portugal, where Portugal has in a way to sort of repair its relationship with its former colonies. It has a visa program where the country is already trying to attract more migrants. So now there's a system where if your ancestors were a part of former Portuguese colonies, you can become a Portuguese citizen. So one of the writers, Amanda from Goa, which in India, which is a former Portuguese colony, she wrote her personal story about, talking with her grandmother about how it was in the legacy of colonialism, and then now how she's become a Portuguese citizen and how, that's helping her. And Portugal right now, especially in Europe, where migration is such a contentious topic, Portugal seems to be that one country that sort of accepted the complexity of migration and found solutions to attract migrants. And one of it is this visa system. The next slide. We also looked at how complicating the narrative could be used in photography. So some of the photography, because a big part of this magazine was sort of decolonizing the lens, because how former colonies have been imagined so far have always been from a white man's gaze. But here we had some photographers who sort of imagined that, okay, if you actually painted the real picture, this is how it could look. So Tamara is a really good photographer from Iraq, who spoke about who this is something she's just reimagined. But CTN is also, I think, they're still trying to look into how it could be more effective in photography. But these were some photographers who toyed around with it. So Tamara was one. Then in the next slide we have yeah, this is you should check her out. Patrick Waterhouse. So he took these photographs in Australia where he he photographed the indigenous people there in this manner to kind of decolonize the lens. He looked at this as a solution, let's say, but I'm going to let you just look and take in the photo. And yeah, I think the photo itself is powerful and speaks for itself. So I would leave it at that.
I think that's beautiful.
Thank
you, Priyanka. This is such a fantastic issue where, correct me if I'm wrong, this was one of the magazine's best-selling issues. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, unfortunately, it's sold out, and I don't know if they made new copies, but I think you can read it online. There's a digital version as well. But after this, I mean, continuing to freelance. Right now, I'm actually working on an audio story for a radio program in Albuquerque called Peace Talk Radios, where they started after the 9/11 terrorist attack in the US, where they basically look into making peace with complex topics. So if you're an audio journalist, it would be really interesting to listen to them, where they just have conversations with a lot of like conflict mediators, rabbis, exactly what CTN experts are, to try and understand how you make peace with conflicting topics. And I'm sort of looking at it with the aspect of migration in Europe, and how migration is such a common thing. People are always going to be on the move, but it's every time a group turns up outside borders, debates heat up amongst politicians. So how do you just accept that it's difficult, it's complex, but then find solutions to make peace with it? So yeah, it's definitely something that I use in reporting. But when it comes to breaking news stories, it is difficult because you do need a little bit more time with CTN. So I personally, for me, I would use it when I have more time and it's a long form piece. I like it better that way. But I love if someone tries it out with breaking news and it works, I'd love to learn.
That's so great. I think you summarized this very well. And I love comparing your example with Sharon's, whereas Sharon's was really focused, I'd say her package was very focused on solution stories. Yours was focused on photojournalism and complicating the narratives in a different way. Yes, we had the solution story about Portugal, but because this is such a complicated and deep topic, I love the way that you and the magazine approached it. And I really love that you're taking this forward in your own reporting now. I'd love to pass it to the crowd if we have any questions. And I could start with one, which is, do you have a favorite interview question that you rely on when doing these sorts of investigations?
Oh, wow. A favorite interview question. I mean, usually in audio, it's always, what do you have for breakfast? I don't know. I just feel that just instantly makes everyone comfortable.
True.
Favorite, well, that's a tough question. But I think it's always, it goes, as soon as I feel someone's comfortable, it just goes into, I think I feel like I always get like better answers when I say, but personally, how do you feel about that? Especially with like diplomats and everything, as soon as it's important to get them comfortable and then get the personal aspect. So
that's right. That's so true. And I heard you say earlier that you really appreciate looping as a technique.
Yes. I think that looping is connected to what I said earlier. It's something that I just feel in that first question of what do you think about this crisis or whatever is not going to give you that answer. It's going to require repeated questioning to really get to the underlying motive. And that's something that I just absolutely love. It takes it might take a little longer than, you know, if you have just 5 minutes with a person, it might take a few more minutes, but it really adds value to your story. And you sometimes get to know facts that people, it makes your source feel comfortable as well. And yeah, it's been rewarding. And it helps you listen to understand, like I said before.
Yes. To understand. That's a beautiful phrase. I see Emily has her hand raised if you wanted to come off mute.
Thank you. I was really interested, Priyanka, at the notion of solutions photography and the photographs you were showing us. And I would just like you to just pick whichever one you would like from your slideshow and just to unpack a bit about in what way the photograph is using different techniques.
So I'm not the photographer of those pictures, so I don't think I will do complete justice to explain what their thoughts were when they were photographing it. But I think all the three of them, so there was also another photographer named Hannah Morales, who was based in the Philippines. But between Patrick, Tamara, and Hannah, they were just really keen on taking away the white man's gaze of former colonies or people from these regions. So they try to photograph it in how, let's say, if I had to put it in the right way, I think Hannah, the phrase she used was the way, so she comes from Philippines, and she basically said the way a Filipino would photograph it versus the way an American coming to Philippines would photograph it would be really different. Is what her personal view.
What way? What I'm just really curious and interested in when you say that. In what way is? I mean, obviously, I'm asking you a difficult question because you weren't there and you weren't photographing it. But from what you understand, you know, this is a beautiful, compassionate photo of somebody fishing.
Yeah, this is something she reimagined. So if you look at the background, it's the original marsh. But then she was like, if she took the picture, she would take care of the woman fishing or something like that. It wouldn't just show the barren marsh. So she had this entire diary of sort of reimagining the lens if she was the photographer. So that was her way of decolonizing that original photo.
Because she's putting it in context. She's putting the broader context into the image rather than just one of desperation and victimhood. She's more empowering the individual through giving the context of water and them actively, you know, doing a job and all of that. Is that right? As an agent?
Yeah. In fact, as an example right now, for example, there's an entire Instagram page of Nat Geo Afghanistan, which is entirely like, instead of just, because whenever you Google Afghanistan, you only see pictures of war and, you know, the Taliban leaders, etc. But Nat Geo Afghanistan is fully focusing on pictures about nature and the music and more about like sort of showing you the other side, which isn't often really seen. So Tamara is sort of also focusing on that with respect to Iraq.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a great question and explanation of this. One last question for you, Priyanka. This comes from Kate in the chat, who would like to see or know a little bit more about what looping is. And if we could, I'm happy to do an example with you. But do you want to explain a bit more about what exactly is looping?
Okay, so I think for me, looping is just having a normal conversation with the person, but really just talking to each other. So I don't know, Jules, do you want to practice? But it's basically saying, okay, so if we had to do it just as two people who don't know each other, who are trying to get to know each other, you could talk to me about anything you wanted, or I would ask you what your name is and what you do, and then you would tell me, and then I I would pick up, maybe you'd say, okay, I'm a doctor and I love my job. And then I would pick up on that and say, okay, why do you love your job? Can you tell me a little bit about what you do? You tell me all of it. And then I repeat what you say to be like, okay, you love your job because you like helping people and you like saving lives. Did I get that right? And then you tell me whether I got it right or wrong. And then I go on to ask you the next question that, okay, if you like, if I'm sure you save a lot of lives in a day, but it could be very hectic. What are your views on it? So I kind of listen to you. I repeat what you say to make sure that I've understood it correctly. So that's sort of like a little bit of fact checking, and then go deeper to the next question. And it's basically me really understanding, really listening carefully to everything that you're saying. I hope I explained that. I don't know if that made complete sense.
So if I could loop back what you just said,
Yeah.
you would describe looping as having a normal conversation, no real special questions you ask, but listening to understand and picking up on keywords, especially if there might be some emotion in those words, to then dig deeper. Did I have that right?
Yeah.
Great. See, so
but then if you also, I would respect if you didn't want to dig deeper on certain things. So then, it's just really a process of getting to know each other well enough, I'd say.
Beautiful. Brilliant. We're talking about looping, we're doing looping. And I believe, yes, Adam just posted in the chat some of the questions we use, which can then lead us to loop, right? So you'd ask that question, someone would answer. And a technique we, I think, often say is to look out for red flag words where someone, right, says, something is painful or that was really hard. That would be a time for the journalist to say, I'm hearing that this is painful for you. Tell me more about that.
Yeah. Also, in this case of painful, you would say, tell me more about that. And you're also welcome to say, well, this particular group thinks about it this way. So that way, especially when it's like, if you're covering something on like far right topics, and then the group from the left doesn't agree, you can ask them what they think the other group thinks about it or something. Yeah, that works as well.
Right. That's a great addition. Priyanka, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Really great to hear from you. I'm just keeping an eye on the clock, and I want to make sure we have time for our lovely last presenter, Emily. It's really hard to separate Complicating the Narratives from Emily's work. As soon as we announced this fellowship, I had so many people from my team saying, you have to talk to Emily. And there's a reason why. Emily has been working with BBC for a long time. She currently leads the Crossing Divide season, which focuses on bringing people together across lines of politics, class, background, age, and geography. Emily's going to talk a little bit today about some of that work, and specifically this deep listening project. And so you can read all about her here, but now I'll just turn it over to Emily to talk a little bit about some of the work she's been doing in this intersection space.
Thank you so much, Jules. I'm really delighted to be here. And I've had a really lovely relationship. In fact, David Bornstein I've probably known for 10 years, since I saw him at Skull World Forum, I think about a decade ago. And just very quickly, so about 6 years ago, I started, because I had a kind of sideline in Impact. I'd been 70% BBC since my kids were small and started to do work outside the BBC. Actually my boss at BBC News got me to go off onto some Danish solutions conference, and I went, not a conference, symposium, and then I started to introduce solutions journalism, what we called solution focused journalism, into BBC News and wrote articles about it. And then I did loads of workshops and got lots of visitors, including David and Tina, to come and talk to us at BBC News. And then a mate of mine who ran the Persian service, I said, what do I do to really kind of make a difference here? She said, you need to go for one subject and you need to do a season, Emily, and it needs to be air pollution. And I went, what? And then I looked into it and it was a perfect thing, a focus to get all of BBC News to tell for a week stories about air pollution. And in fact, rather bizarrely, I was made one of the top 10 influencers on air pollution. It was a commercial company. It was a bit of a joke. Anyway, and then from there, I was thinking about what next. And I've always been interested in engaging across divides, long interested in talking to strangers. Has been another personal interest of mine for a long time. And so I started this Crossing Divide season about 2018, I think it was. And I then started to, we got the whole of the BBC News, and then the following year, the whole of the BBC, to tell stories of people coming together across these divides. And as part of the research, and I'm sorry if I'm talking too quick, as part of my thinking about how you engage people to get them to make these connections, I started researching, talking to, psychologists, psychoanalysts, mediators, went on the brilliant SJN mediating course with Amanda and Gary and these brilliant mediators, and then did a course in Jerusalem at Lockdown Online with this brilliant professor of listening, and started to do a lot more research into this space. And I was practitioner in residence at LSC last year and researched all about deep listening, which is effectively a bit like the looping, but a little bit more sophisticated and complicated. But it is about attention and intention. It's about listening to yourself in order to be in a place to listen to others. And it is about capturing the essential essence of what you understand the other person has said, in order to reflect that back tentatively for them to go deeper into understanding themselves and potentially deeper to sharing with you. And there is very substantial research, it's not that substantial, but it's very interesting research, that when people feel truly heard, they lower their attitude extremity. So I'm now working with this deep listening space. I've just been given a new role as in July as senior research visiting fellow at King's College, doing more research into this deep listening, particularly around crossing divides. So, okay, that's all kind of well and good. What the hell's this got to do with my day job? You might well ask that question. I'm very lucky at BBC News because I've had a job which is called Head of Special Projects, which has allowed me to think up special projects and kind of slightly go down my avenue, so where I wanted to do it. So what I've been doing is I thought I want to do more of this. So I called my friends at the British Council, because I didn't work with them over years, and basically got them to pay to produce this thing we did in Lebanon last year. And if we go to the next slide, oh no, that's not that, that's a film. So, oh yeah, I got we can go to the film if you want. Do you want to see a film, 3-minute film? So I taught 150 people, 200 people in deep listening in Salford. We're probably a super spreader event, 5th of March, 2020. And we got them to cross divide. So why don't we have a little film for fun?
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. We're going to say some wishes to the Zoom gods that this works. I've got this film all queued up, and give me a thumbs up if
BBC News is bringing people together today who disagree. And
sorry, yes.
Yeah, bigger on the bottom right. Yeah.
Okay, great.
And who might never normally meet to discuss the big issues in an event called Crossing Divides Live.
There's a very simple ambition at the heart of Crossing Divides and this festival, and it's really to help us communicate with people who may hold completely different ideas to our own.
I am very opinionated, and sometimes I am guilty of voicing my opinions too loudly. Today I'm hoping to learn how to listen.
I think I'm ready to try to stop shouting at each other and start listening, and hopefully build the relationship that we need to be able to take this country that I love forward.
When we're in a conversation, we get dead excited and we end up talking over each other too much, and then we're stopping each other. No, it's okay, you say it. More than anything, I'm going to really try, shut up and actually listen.
We've sat them down opposite somebody who we know they disagree with fundamentally on those issues, but we taught them how to do something called deep listening.
when we listen to somebody else deeply, they will then feel heard. And it's only when we're heard that we're able to start lowering our defenses and being open to understanding that there are many different perspectives and many different points of view.
It felt really good that he listened, but it also felt good that he understood what I was trying to say, and he was going that extra mile to make me feel better.
I think I was being educated as well, so it was a really interesting talk that we had.
I found it difficult because listening has become a lost art, and it was actually quite refreshing to do so.
Taking that time to really listen to someone who you might not necessarily talk to in your everyday life, and hearing their views as well, and just giving them that space to talk openly to you, it was really quite powerful.
If we can use ourselves some of these techniques of listening, we will actually do much better journalism that connects with the people we serve.
She had a millennial Remainer and an ancient Brexiteer, coming at the problem from two very relevant and sensible sides. I think we both got a good empathy of each other's positions.
Yeah, totally.
I have learned that you can have opposite opinions on some subjects, but find other subjects that you have in common and build a relationship on that, and allowing to respect what you don't agree, because it's impossible with anybody to agree with everything.
Wow. So that was in person, which was a lot of fun. But of course, you can do these things virtually. So approached the British Council, and last March, I think it was then, I trained 150 people in Lebanon in deep listening. We wanted to go to a post-conflict society. That was 6 hours, 3 times 2 hours over 3 weeks. And that was pretty successful in that, well, we asked them a year later, wrote 150 emails, and we got 46 responses, which is pretty good given that lots of emails bounced. And vast majority had really made changes to their lives because of, no, take two. Vast majority were positive, and I talked to 4 people who had made changes in their lives, including one woman who said she would for sure be divorced if she hadn't put on this course. So I wrote that piece in which I drew upon the stories of just interviewing people who've been on the course. And now what I'm doing, and I've been partly training for 2 hours today, so excuse me if I'm slightly, not quite myself, but in May, I'll be training 1,000 people in 100 countries in deep listening for, again, 3 times 2 hours. And we're actually breaking them down into 4 cohorts because I'm trying some slightly different modules. I'm working with academics from University of Reading to give really clear, we can get rid of this, we can get rid of the slides, I think, to give really clear evaluation of the impact of the training. And so we're also training facilitators, and I'm training BBC people in East Africa in Amharic, Swahili, Somali, and maybe that's it, can't remember, some East African languages, and they're going to be offering some deep listening training in audiences in their own languages. We're experimenting with that. So we're trying lots of stuff. And in fact, I'm hoping with the British Council to be able to do some work otherwise. I'm very excited about this deep listening stuff, as you can see, and use it to cross divides. While I was listening to the other speakers, I also just put some links in here. And one thing which was following on from a question that was asked of somebody else, which was, I wanted to see using this in journalism. So I went to talk to dairy farmers who don't believe in climate change. And I deep listened to this guy who didn't believe in climate change, a very interesting person, and believed it was all a part of a conspiracy to hate farmers that was part of central office and blah, blah. And I, did that listening to him to try and understand his perspective. And I'll tell you, there's a brilliant book that I recommend, which I think, she's a sociologist and she does this really well. I don't know if anybody's read this book, where she's a lefty and she spends time with people who are in Louisiana who, don't want to make changes because of climate, even though they are suffering. And she does it beautifully, actually. And she uncovers what she says is their deeper narrative. And that's what I tried to do with the dairy farmers that you can read up. What I was really pleased about is I showed them the article after it was published, and this key guy felt that he had been heard, and he was really pleased, even though I put in loads of caveats saying climate change exists, dairy farmers are part of the problem, blah, blah, but he still felt heard. So I do think that it is possible to do it. And I should say the reason that I'm, believing in doing this, both Crossing Divides story and the deep listening, and we will, in fact, I might ask them for your help. We are trying to collect these brilliant 5 pairs of people who we want to track and talk to them before the training. They do the training. We've sort of filmed doing the Crossing Divides, and then I want to showcase them afterwards. But it's really bloody hard to find people, let's say an American, a Canadian, who is, oh, by the way, we're doing for the 1,000, they've all got to be 18 to 34, who, let's say, is not a climate skeptic, believes that science is bullshit, but believes that climate change there's too much priority given to climate change, and why should they have to change their behavior and their other priorities in their life? Somebody like that, because we can't go for a complete skeptic, to then track to their journey, talking to somebody. I think we've got somebody in Brazil who's passionate about climate change and wants to make that difference. Not easy to, when you're trying to make, TV, which is what we're trying to do, to get these type of people to be able to follow them on their journey. So that's one of our challenges. We've got, I think, 6 people out of the 10, and their training starting in a week. So it's tough. Happy to take questions about any of that.
Well, who's here to help with that? I mean, that sounds like an incredible initiative, Emily. And
if you look at the Lebanon story, if you are willing to help, well, for starters, we've actually, the other thing is we want to have 1,000 people, and we got 1,300. Unfortunately, some of them had to go into the bin because they were just bots from Malaysia or something. So we haven't got to 1,000 yet, and we want them spread across the world, and they get to do this training 18 to 34. So there's still space for people to do the training if they come from particular countries. And in the Lebanon story, there is a link where they can apply. And then we're looking for some very particular people over some conflicts, like somebody who believes in the death penalty from Asia, who's 18 to 34 and is not crazy. Anyway, any questions on that, all that? Sorry, I just gave you a lot of and apologies for that.
Absolutely. No, that was fantastic, Emily. I saw people's faces lighting up when they saw the film, which really speaks for itself in terms of how much this resonates with you. Like Emily said, yes, you are brilliant, Emily, says Jody.
Happy to answer questions about it. And if you do want to learn more about deep listening, I can share my SSIR piece, which is about 5,000 words on the subject, with Jules, and she can share it with you. You can't publish it because it's behind a paywall, but I'm allowed to share it to people I've trained or taught or something. So very happy, to share that with you, Jules.
Yes, let's definitely do that. And for everyone here today, I'll be sharing all the stories we talked about, as well as Emily's SSIR article. We've got about 1 minute left if anyone wants to come off mute and either ask a question or leave a comment with Emily. I know the chat is speaking for itself in terms of the great enthusiasm they have for this work.
Yeah, it's quite fun. I would say that, for those who may be working in big organizations like my own, I do think sometimes we accept that we have to do roles that are there, and I appreciate that. I'm super lucky with a role that I've somehow managed to find, but I think there's a lot of openness now because of traditional news organizations, stuff isn't working, and there's space for people to have passions and to say, I want to try this, and partner, and especially like, for example, this big training 1,000 people, we're doing it to celebrate BBC 100, but apart from my time, British Council's paying for everything because it's in their interest. They want to do it. They're super excited. So, if you can kind of get the right alignment where you play a game and you get a bit of, input, a bit of excitement from one, and you slightly exaggerate it, and you go to somebody else and then slightly exaggerate, and you kind of build up this enough support that you can then make things from being a kind of crazy idea to happening. And that's what I've done in lots of different ways for a number of years. And I think that is possible. I come from world service. I used to run arts and all sorts of religion and all sorts of different areas, but I don't come from a traditional BBC News kind of, from one of the key programs or a correspondent or those type of roles. And I still think that there's space. So for those who are working, you know, you can be entrepreneurs and make things happen which aren't classically part of your business. I think that's possible.
You know, Emily, that's a great note to close with, because it is because of you and entrepreneurs like you that we've designed this fellowship such that we're asking for projects that are not just, you know, pitching solutions journalism stories, but also pitching community events, conversations like this, resources for other journalists. So as we sign off today, first of all, let's thank our speakers once again, Emily, Priyanka, and Sharon. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions about this fellowship, which is asking US journalists to apply with projects like the ones you saw today, please feel free to reach out, check out the guidelines I've just posted in the chat, and then feel free to be in touch with any questions you might have. Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye.
Have a great day.
Thank you.